The JobKeeper payment, $130 billion to pass Parliament this week. You've described it as a lifeboat in very choppy economic seas. Now, there are a few points of contention from Labor. If I could go through each, if you don't mind. First, on casual employees, sure. Are you flexible on that 12-month requirement?
Well, we have to have a definition. Even in expenditure of this enormous amount, you have to have a definition of who's in and what is a casual for the purposes of this particular scheme. What we've done is use a principle that exists in the Fair Work Act, which is about a regular casual, if you like, someone who has been regularly connected with their employer for 12 months. Now, the basic principle we're not moving away from. Obviously, that has to find its expression in the actual words, and they'll be refined as we go through drafts, but that is the principle that we're applying here.
Just one employer, or is it regular contact with a number?
Just one employer, and that is a standard definition that exists in the Fair Work Act at the moment. But keep in mind that the JobKeeper system that comes through the employer, the $1,500, works in parallel and tandem with the job seeker payment, which is a doubling of the rate of New Start, so around $1,000. Anyone who is a casual employer can supplement that without losing any money up to $100. Mm-hmm. So the actual amount of support is going to be very similar through access to either scheme. But you have to have a definition around a casual employer or employee, or which employers are able to access the scheme. There was an announcement from the Treasurer this morning that we've expanded the access to those who are NGOs and not-for-profits with a different level or measure of distress. So definitions are being refined, but the principle about what counts as a casual employee for the purposes of this scheme is a principle we have lifted from the Fair Work Act. It's a sensible principle, and that's the one that we'll be sticking with.
Do you still accept that about 1 million casual employees may not then have access to that?
Well, they won't have... there's about 1 million casuals who might not be able to show that they've had 12 months consistent attachment to an employer. But keep in mind that for those casuals that do show that, there's no limit on the number of hours they need to have worked. So some casuals would have been connected to an employer for 12 months or more, would have only worked a day a week. Now, they'll find themselves moving straight up to the $1,500 payment. But casuals who don't fall inside the JobKeeper system, which comes through the employer, will still be able to access the welfare system through the job seeker payment, which is a doubling of the rate of New Start, which still allows for the casual to work up to $104 without losing a single cent of the payment. So no one's getting left behind and arguing endlessly about whether someone will be accessing one side of this enormous suite of responses or the other side of the enormous suite of responses isn't a particularly fruitful argument to be having. We've got 48 hours, $130 billion worth of lifeboats. They're getting pushed out in 48 hours. Yep. The greater concern I've got is with Labor's position, which is that we should wait and try and amend 121 awards and some high percentage of 11,000 enterprise agreements and individual contracts covering 4 million Australians. I mean, that would be an almighty mess. And why on earth would we wait to rescue Australian workers, 6 million of them?
Well, just on that, Christian Porter, this one-size-fits-all approach, we just spoke to Brendan O'Connor. He has suggested that there could be a more palatable solution here, that what you propose is in legislation, it passes through Parliament, but would you put in a provision, perhaps, that would allow the Fair Work Commission to maybe adapt, fix any problems that arise on the run?
Well, the legislation that we're drafting has a role written into it for the Fair Work Commission. When employers make a decision about how they apply the $1,500, that's a decision that can be taken to the Fair Work Commission. So, I mean, you know, that much is obvious. I don't think Brendan O'Connor's suggesting anything that we didn't think of a week ago. But what Labor, and let's be clear about this, right? What Labor are suggesting is don't legislate to allow the $1,500 payments to flow, but rather hope that once the system is put in place that allows the money to be there, that we can change 121 different awards, a high percentage of 11,000 enterprise agreements, and a high percentage of individual contracts that cover 4 million Australians, right? Let's hope we can do that over the coming weeks or months or longer. That, to me, is madness. We are pushing the $130 billion worth of lifeboats out in 48 hours to 6 million Australian workers. Their jobs depend on it. Why would we do it the monstrously hard, uncertain and difficult way which could take months when we can do it the simple, clear, parliamentary way in 48 hours?
But you are happy to consider and perhaps strengthen those provisions you say is already in this legislation that allows the Fair Work Commission perhaps to look at some of any unintended consequences that might come from it?
Well, look, they're suggesting something that's already inside the draft.
Okay.
I mean, the Fair Work Commission will play a role in reviewing the relevant decisions from employers who access the scheme. I mean, that much is obvious. Like, if that's the great contribution, the Brains Trust needs to get back and do some more work because that's already been thought of.
OK, let's talk about the Ruby Princess. This is now a criminal investigation. Is that fair enough?
Well, you know, investigations are there for the purposes of gathering and amassing evidence, but in my observation, that's a very sensible investigation to commence. If there were statements that were made fraudulently, and that's an if because the evidence has to be collected, that would be a very, very serious matter indeed in all of the context of what occurred. To me, a criminal investigation is absolutely what should happen.
Are you concerned about how Carnival Australia has handled this so far?
Well, look, I don't have all of the details, and that's why you have an investigation, but I think that anyone who is seeing the reports that anyone can see on the media would be suggesting that they've handled it far from perfectly. Whether or not there's any criminal wrongdoing is yet to see. But if you know something and you deliberately and misleadingly say something else and there are consequences for that, that of course can be fraudulent and a very serious offence. We'll see whether or not there's evidence of such wrongdoing, but that would be a very serious thing if that occurred.